Hello and welcome to Hastings Community TV. My name is Tim Collins and I'm the superintendent of the Hastings School District. And no, we do not have a bond or levy coming up. I know that that's usually when I come on the air, but we do not have that coming up for a while. Thank you for the approval last November. But you know, we're just here to share some information about our school data, and with me today is Jenn Reichel. Jenn, you've been with us for
This is my fourth year.
Fourth year already, and Jenn is our Director of Teaching and Learning, and it's, how do we explain what the role of Director of Teaching and Learning is? It's really doing a lot. It's professional development with our teachers, it's professional development with our administrators, it's looking at scores, it's looking at best practices in teaching. It's
taking a look at the pre-K-12 journey of our kiddos and helping make that better and better every year.
And so there's two reasons that I wanted to do this show with Jenn, and one of the reasons is that I always want the transparency and the honesty of how are we doing as a school. And this is just a small snapshot and just one of the many things that we look at. I share with board members, it's just not test results that we look at, it's just not data. There's ACT, there's MCAs, there's NWA, there's lots of different scores that we look at. We look at graduation rate, attendance rate. But you know, recently the state has come in and said we do have, you know, five things that we do want to look at. We're not going to go through all of those today, but we're just going to give a little bit of a snapshot. And Jenn did this presentation to our school board about a week ago, and I thought, you know what, that'd be good information for the community to see how we're doing. And the other thing that I wanted to do the show today is that about 7 months ago, the city of Hastings and the school district went together and they did a proclamation, and they said that we are going to accept all here. We are going to look to improve how we reach out and be proactive on our diversity and equity. And I think that part of today's presentation is going to show you, the viewer, how we look at the diversity, how we look at the equity in some ways of what we're doing, what we're trying to accomplish with all of our students. We're going to talk about that as we go through the data. So with that, are you ready? Because I know that you know this much better than I do.
I'm ready.
All right, so we're going to, as I said, we're going to go through the program. And after watching this, if you have further questions, as always, feel free to email or give Jenn or myself a call. We'd gladly want to bring clarity to it. And if we would get several questions on an issue, then we might hop back on a show and give even further data. But up on your screen is sharing our data, and I'm going to let Jenn talk about the Minnesota Comprehensive Assessments. That's most of the data that we're looking at in the program. So just take it away, Jenn, and share a little bit about the Minnesota Comprehensive Assessments.
Perfect. So the MCAs, the Minnesota Comprehensive Assessments, are tests that our students take every single year in the spring. We do 3 tests: reading, which happens for all students in grades 3 through 8, and then again in grade 10. We do math, all students in grade 3 through 8, and then again in grade 11. And then for science, our students in grade 5, grade 8, and one time in high school they take those tests. Now we know that the MCAs aren't the end-all be-all of data, but it is something that we can look at and compare how are we doing across the state, because every single district takes these tests.
I think too that one of the things that you shared with the board when looking at the Minnesota Comprehensive Assessments, it's really good data when you're looking at it as a state.
Yep.
It's pretty good data when you're looking at it as a school district, and a school district with some size to it.
Yep.
But when you look at it just as Tim Collins' daughter, then the data isn't as valid, as strong.
Yeah, so when we take a look at the error of measurement, if you will, the more students we have in a group, like the whole state, we can see some trends and be really confident that that data is accurate. And the fewer kids that we look at in a group, like you said, when we get down to that one student, there's a lot of error possibilities. So when you get that assessment result, and you'll get those by fall conferences this year for students who were in grades 3 through 8 and that high school grade last year, you'll see that score, but know that that score really is kind of a range of where they're performing.
So the next thing up on the screen, or hopefully that you at home are watching, is diversity and the different aspects of diversity that we do have in our school district. And sometimes when people hear diversity, they really think just race. But we're looking at male, female. How do male students do in math and science versus female students? How do they do in reading? Are we treating them equitably?
Right.
We look at socioeconomic. If you come from a family that has financial means, how do you do compared to a student who comes from a family that's on free and reduced? And of course, then we also look at other categories as well. And I think that when you look at the one part of the screen where it lists the Asian, the Black, African American, Hispanic, American Indian, some of those we have very, very small groups, and we'll talk about that later.
Yep.
But the one that popped out to me was you shared that 2 or more races. There was some concern about that now being a category, and I've been a superintendent for 25 years now. I've never seen 2 or more races on there. So could you explain some of the concerns and why that's in there?
Yeah, so the state wanted to look at making sure that people were accurate in the representation of where they live as far as their racial or ethnic background. The problem or the challenge is when you live in that 2 or more races, and I'm going to call it a bucket for right now because that's how we sort data. When you live in 2 or more races, unfortunately, when the state looks at data, they don't assign you to a different race. So if you happen to be part Hispanic and part white, if you're not performing as well, and we know that we have to allocate some resources to our Hispanic population, you wouldn't count in that group because you live in 2 or more races. One of the groups that's really advocating strongly to look deeper into this 2 or more races is our Native American population. They see that we know nationally that we have some opportunities for growth with our Native American families, and when a family is part Native American and part something else, then we're not targeting that particular student when we look at the data. We can figure that out internally, but when we look at the data, they don't count in a different place. They only live in that 2 or more races category. So the state, I know, is continuing to look at how do we make that work and how do we best represent students. But we want to make sure that we're targeting our resources toward the people, the students who are in need most, and that doesn't always help us do that.
I know also that on the side where we look at the demographics, I think most of them are self-explanatory, but there's probably 2 that need a little bit more discussion. And English language services, some people at home might be, well, what do you mean English language services? Is that when my child's in 7th or 8th grade and they're in an English class? And no, that's not what it is.
Those are for students who are learning the English language. So they may come from a family who speaks a different language at home or came from a different country, and so we are providing support in addition to their language arts class to help them learn the English language.
And these are students that they may be 2nd generation or 3rd generation. Their parents were maybe born and raised here and went to public education. So there's different criteria for qualifying. And then another one on there is the identified as homeless. And I think that if you're of my age, homeless means that you were living in a cardboard box or you were living in the back seat of a car. That's what I thought of when I grew up of what was homeless. There are many variations of homeless now, and it could be that you're living in a car. It could be that you're living on the streets. But it also can be that you're a student who you're not getting along with mom and dad, and you're not living with them, and you're living with a friend, and then 1 week later you're living with another friend, and then 1 week later you're living with another friend. It might be that your parents have some very tough financial luck. They maybe both lost their job. You now for 3 months to 4 months are living with aunt and uncle. So there are different degrees and qualifications for homeless, and we do have homeless students attending the Hastings School District. So we want to mainly focus on probably the top 3 in that category. But as we go
Maybe
through
4.
3 or 4, but as we go through the presentation, we wanted you to know some of the background about those categories. Next up on the screen is how do we do in reading? How do we do in reading for these comparable groups? And I'll let Jen talk about it a little bit and give some of the background information. And again, I'll go through some of the questions that maybe we asked as board members.
Sure. So what you see here is our reading proficiency. And when we say proficient, what that means is we look at our state standards. There are a number of questions that the state generates that allows students to show what they know and what they've learned over the course of a year. And it's that score of, yep, you have enough knowledge that you showed on this one test to live in that proficiency or exceeds expectations. And know that we have many students who are super close to that proficiency, but you're just not going to see their data in here. So we have at the very top the statewide all students. It's just a good reference point as to how we're doing compared to the state, and then how are we. And this is all of our students, grades 3 through 10 in an average. And then we look at our male and female and we see a difference there, and we know that we have some work to do to target our male students and help them show what they know better about reading. The next one down is receiving special ed services, and we see that the lines between those two, those who are receiving and not receiving, are pretty different. And we expect that that's going to happen because students who are on an IEP, an individual education plan, they need support in order to meet those grade level expectations. So when we dig further into special ed, we take a look at how do we compare to other districts, and we'll get to that later in the presentation. So while we want to see our students of special ed who are receiving special ed services do better on their data, this isn't super alarming. Then we look at our students who are receiving our English language services, and then finally those who are eligible to receive free and reduced lunch or not.
And for me, and because I know what will show up later on in the presentation, there were two that jumped out to me, at me that I was like, whoa, I knew that we would be having less scores in those areas, and you mentioned them already for students with special services. But for me, I was like, why is it that if you come from a home with less money, that you don't do as well in reading? Because I grew up in a home that my parents did not have money, but my mother still took me to the library. I was still expected to read. So why does that have an impact on reading? Well, yes, my parents at least had the means to get me to the library. Some of our families don't have the means to do that. My parents, even though I came from not much money, they still were able to fill out the Scholastic Reader, and I was able to get some books in that situation. So I had to think that there are people that were even less fortunate than me that don't have the means to get the resources. And it's our job as a school district to figure out how we can get the resources in their hand. Again, I think the next graph up is looking at now how do we break it down, from a ethnic standpoint. And one of the things that Jen reminded the board members is that in some of these groups we have very small numbers. So if you have 2 or 3 students score well or 2 or 3 students score poorly, the percentage is really going to be reflected. But again, when you're looking at this and questioning, why are we having the diversity and the equity conversation in our community? From a school standpoint, our board members know why we're having it. This is not the fault of the children and the mom and dad that Native American students are scoring 35 percentage points less than our white students. We as a district have a responsibility to find out what can we do to reach out, what can we do to get students and families connected so that they do score as well.
Yep. And you said it right. When we look at the MCAs, the Minnesota Comprehensive Assessments, it's really judging how are we doing as a school district, not how does this individual student do. So you're absolutely right. We own that data, and we have to look at how do we do better to support these students in our system.
And the point of the program today isn't to let you know, well, what are you doing? But I do think that we'll come back in a month or two and share some of our initiatives of how we are trying to reach out and connect and show improvement for all of our students. Math, we've looked at reading, now we're going to look at math. And I'll just let you, again, take it away, and I'll hop in and interject on some of the comments that either I had or other people had. So I know that the viewer at home also can see the percentages, but go ahead.
Yeah, the thing that we're really excited about with math is we're seeing some improvement across the board in elementary and middle school and in high school. Our teachers have spent the last 2.5 years really digging into what's important to do in math instruction. We have some new resources across the board, and it's really not about the stuff, it's not about the books, but it's about how we use those materials to teach. And we're seeing that the work that teachers have been engaged in is really paying off. So it's exciting. When we look at the state, we are outperforming them in a significant way. Our male students outperform our female, but not by much. And that, I think the school board was really interested in, to know that, we might expect that our female students aren't going to perform as well, not because they don't have the aptitude for math, but sometimes they take a back seat and just say, hey, I will let somebody else do that, and we're not finding that. So that's excellent to see. Really great growth in all of those areas.
Yeah, I actually talked about that on the radio show last week, that when I was growing up, it was a perception that male students were more acclimated to do well in math and science. And Dan Massman from the radio station said, yeah, that was true. And I said, part of our perception became our reality. So I was really pleased to see that for male, female students scoring very well in math and very equitable there. And now, again, the next graph just looks at it from a percentage standpoint. I don't know if we want to share too much more on that. I know on the screen, the viewer at home will just, you can look at it and see again where we have some gaps that we have to close.
The only thing I would add to that is just a reminder that when we see those 2 dots next to our Asian population and our American Indian, Alaskan Native, because those populations are so small, 1 or 2 students makes a huge difference in the length of that bar.
And one of the things that I said is that you can look at state average, but some schools in Minneapolis and St. Paul may bring up or down the state average. There might be pockets across the state that bring down the state average. I want to know how Hastings is doing for our comparison to school districts that look like us. And so I gave Jen the task of what are some comparable school districts that look like us, not only in student population. And so I asked Jen to kind of sort out and look at school districts that were comparable to us. And up on the screen are some of the school districts that Jen said, hey, these I believe are comparable to us. And you can read them for yourself: Buffalo, Cambridge, Isanti, Centennial, Farmington, Forest Lake, etc. And why don't you just share some of what went into the looking like us? What was some of the criteria?
So we began with just sorting all of the districts in the state by size, because we knew that was like the first place we go to. Is we want to make sure that a district that we compare ourselves to doesn't have 200,000 students. And then once we had a list of school districts that were sort of like us, then we looked into what are the percentages in each of the racial ethnic groups, percentage of English language learners, special ed, free and reduced lunch, and homeless, and really just distilled that down to which districts have the most in common with us. And so we might have in the past looked at districts that are close to us, but some of those districts don't look like us. They're smaller than us, or they have, just not the populations that we do. So the list that we saw on the other slide, they really have populations that look very similar to us, even if they're a little bit bigger than us or smaller than us.
So then, now the graph up on your screen puts it probably like in a rank order of how we compare. And when you're looking at reading on the MCA trends, we're, what do you say, middle of the pack?
We're middle of the pack.
And, so as a board and as a superintendent, we want to be number one.
Yep.
But we're also going to give ourselves some kudos for saying we've worked hard, we've made some improvement, and we are in the middle of the pack for comparable school districts in the area of reading. And we definitely know that one of our initiatives this year, and we'll talk about that on another show, is improving our literacy at the elementary level, because that drives the entire district then.
Yep.
The next screen shows how we do in math. And moved up a spot or two, doing a little bit better in math. And of course, we were hoping that would be true because we have had that as a focus over the last 2 or 3 years.
Yep.
And so I think in closing, you, the viewer, you can look at the scores, you can see how we're doing. Part of it, again, as I said, was we wanted to accomplish 2 things today in reaching out to you, is transparency. How are we doing on this test, the Minnesota Comprehensive Assessment? And then to also be able to view the reasons why we are looking at diversity and equity. Jen, I know that we try to keep this to 25 minutes or so. Is there any last comments that you'd make before we part ways?
No, no, not at all. I think the improvement that we've been making in math is great, and we look forward to seeing that improvement in literacy with the work we're doing this year.
And part of that ties back to the work that you've been doing, so thank you for giving us the guidance and saying, hey, these are what best practices should be for Hastings. This is what I'm seeing across the state and across the nation. And we're going to keep rolling up our sleeves and working hard because we do want to be number one. So again, thank you for tuning in. And if you have any questions, feel free to give myself or Jen a call or give us an email. We definitely want to bring clarity and a level of transparency as well. So thank you.